refed.org. And with that, let's jump in. Welcome to today's webinar, Addressing Food Waste Through State Policy, a Toolkit for Action. This is a special session that's hosted by the Zero Food Waste Coalition. And we're so excited to have you joining us today. If you were at the refed Food Waste Solutions Summit in St. Louis this past May, or if you've seen any of the social posts from any of the organizations in the Zero Food Waste Coalition, you've probably heard about the release of the State Policy Toolkit. Well, today we are going to dig in and explain how it works and how it can be used to help inform and educate policymakers about the huge potential for policy to drive action across the food system in the fight against food waste. My name is Dana Gunders, and I'm the Executive Director of refed. For those of you not familiar with refed, we are a national nonprofit working to end food loss and waste across the U.S. food system by advancing data-driven solutions. And we are also one of the partners in the Zero Food Waste Coalition, along with NRDC, WWF, and the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic. The Zero Food Waste Coalition started as an informal coalition among those four organizations and launched with the development and release of the U.S. Food Waste Action Plan, which has now been endorsed by over 60 businesses, nonprofits, and local governments. We also shared priorities for the 2023 Federal Farm Bill, which offers a huge opportunity to enact legislation that can lead to significant reductions in food waste. But today we're talking about the State Policy Toolkit, which was released this past May during the summit. And two things I want to say before I pass things on to our amazing presenters. First, when it comes to food waste policy, state leaders are really at the vanguard of the movement. While the federal government can take many key steps to reduce food waste through things like regulation and funding, state governments are the primary regulators of municipal solid waste. And because of this, they are able to do things that the federal government cannot. They really are in the driver's seat here and are going to be the true agents of change for policy that reduces food waste. Secondly, state policymakers do not need to start from scratch. Across the country, state governments have sought to address food waste by banning organic waste from landfills, mandating or promoting surplus food donation, supporting food recovery and composting infrastructure, and reevaluating how schools handle food waste. States that have implemented these policies have done it through the process of identifying local problems and then rigorously experimenting to develop effective and innovative solutions. And while each state varies, they provide a variety of experiences with food waste reduction that other states and even the federal government can learn from. So all of that is captured in this new toolkit. If you haven't already seen the toolkit, you can use the link that we're sharing in the chat box right now. We'll also be sending that out via email in a few days. I also want to encourage you to take our survey to let us know how you've been using the toolkit or might be planning to use it, because that is information that will help us as we continue to expand on the recommendations. So we're adding that survey link in the chat box now, and we'll be sharing it via email as well. And with that, I am happy to introduce our presenters for today. Andrea Collins is with NRDC, where she is a senior specialist on the Sustainable Food Systems team. Hi, Andrea. And Tori Otto is at the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic, where she is a clinical fellow. Hello, Tori. Tori and Andrea were really the driving forces behind this toolkit, and they are going to walk through it with you now. But before they begin, I want to remind you all to add your questions in the chat box, and I'll be joining Tori and Andrea a bit later during the Q&A session. And with that, I will pass it on to Andrea and Tori.
Great, thank you, Dana. I appreciate that setup. It was wonderful. And I am going to just spend one extra second reiterating what Dana said, that the Zero Food Waste Coalition is working on a wide variety of fronts, including setting out an action plan for the federal government, articulating some of the ideas that we believe belong in the Farm Bill, this state food waste toolkit and model legislation that we are hoping will be useful to all of you. And then we're also doing coalition building and really building a movement to show that there is wide action around food waste. And that's one of the places where we hope you will engage. So if you're not already a member of the Zero Food Waste Coalition, we hope that you will check out the website and sign up to learn more information about all of the coalition work that we are doing. So to jump right in on what the toolkit includes, we looked at a number of policies that states across the country are doing or could be doing to really move the needle when it comes to food waste. And they range from large encompassing bills like organic waste bans or organic mandatory recycling initiatives through compost application, food waste reduction in K through 12 schools, a wide variety of issues on a wide variety of topics. And so we tried to group them together in a way that could help navigate these 15 ideas, including things like building and broadening organic waste bans, which are sometimes just focused on waste, but also occasionally include things like food donation requirements or mandatory reporting laws around what generators are producing. They could also include things like disposal surcharge fees to enable financing of additional measures that a state might want to enact. We've also have a category around opportunities to promote food donation, whether those are increased liability protections, tax incentives, food safety guidelines in order to make sure that that food that is getting donated meets health and safety requirements. Another section around these ideas is really to build out the waste infrastructure that's needed to support an organic waste ban. And those include things like ensuring that your permitting, your zoning, and all of the other technical components that need to allow for food waste infrastructure building for composting and anaerobic digestion facilities is really done in a way that enables that infrastructure support. We've also included in here an idea that isn't necessarily built out so much in the US, but should be included in these ideas around what it needs to take in order to recycle food into animal feeds, another part of the hierarchy that's often left out. The fourth grouping we have here is around circularity and making sure that compost gets put back into the system, whether that's states procuring compost or incentivizing application by other entities to make sure that that compost has an end market. We wanted to also include some work around preventing food waste upstream. And one of these key places where we can prevent food from going to waste is around food date labels, often called expiration dates. It's one of the places where we're seeing some movement on states now, and we wanted to make sure we included some best practices in terms of what those policies could look like. And then our last grouping is one that we've seen government really take the lead in terms of what it could look like for states to be dealing with their own food waste, whether that's K through 12 schools and the opportunities that are around share tables, et cetera. There's also opportunities that governments are already taking around climate action plans or solid waste plans. And we want to make sure that food waste is really integrated holistically into those other activities that are already happening. And lastly, there's an opportunity for financing, whether that's grants or loans for any kind of food waste reduction policy that's happening. And so these wide-ranging 15 policies are ones that we've really taken a deep dive into. And we're hoping that if you are interested and have the time, you will look at all 15 of them, but we've broken them down into a way that you can digest certain segments because so much of our field is segmented in how we look at the food waste problem as a whole. And within each of these policies, we've tried to do a number of different things. We've tried to connect the issue to the food recovery hierarchy, making sure that you're thinking about not just one segment of the hierarchy, even if you're looking at compost application, for example, thinking through the entire hierarchy, ensuring that we take a look at what is already out there, looking at current policies that exist and what they're doing well and what could be part of a best practice. And we also recognize that state policy doesn't exist in a vacuum. And we've included a lot of the federal context to explain how the federal government either creates a baseline or supports existing work, or where there can be gaps that can be filled. We've included kind of an analysis of what makes for good policy. That includes what kinds of considerations need to be included when you're thinking about a policy, so that you're not simply filling one gap, but you're looking at the issue as a whole. What kinds of lessons we've seen in other states as they've gone about moving the ball forward on these. And in some ways, we've seen that there are additional barriers that have been set up as we've gone through from moving legislation into rulemaking or into practice. We've been able to see some things that can be fixed as we go forward. There's also a lot of links to additional resources in case you're interested in a particular issue. There's a lot more information that can be found about any of the policies that exist so far. And then one of the things that I think is really a great component of this toolkit that I'm hoping will be the most useful to folks is that we've really drafted legislation in a way that you can then take this recipe and take it into your own state, so that you have a working model. You don't have to start from scratch. There's already existing language that can then be adapted. And Tori's going to walk us through what some of that looks like.
All right. So like Andrea said, we kind of want to give you an idea of the information that's available in the toolkit. And I think we're just going to do that by running through some of the policies that are included. So I'm going to cover organic waste bans, food donation requirements, tax incentives, and compost procurement. So kind of hitting a few of the buckets, waste bans, promoting food donation, and developing compost end markets. So starting with organic waste bans, if you're not familiar with the model, they are as they sound. They are a ban from sending food waste to landfills. There's a couple of different models, ways of doing that. One is a straight up ban saying you can't throw it in the trash, and that's an organic waste ban. There's also mandatory recycling laws that say, you have to take certain actions with that waste. So you need to send it to like an organics processing facility. And what's really great about, organic waste bans is they're essentially forcing businesses to really reevaluate how they're valuing food as a resource and, encouraging them to take a look at their own supply chain, their own practices, policies, whatever it may be, and manage their food in accordance with the food recovery hierarchy. And they're actually, really growing in popularity. There was another organic waste ban that was just passed recently this year in New Hampshire, which now is the 10th state to have an organic waste ban. New Hampshire's model is that anyone who generates, 1 ton of food waste a week, operates within 20 miles of a facility like an organics processing facility who can process that food waste, really has to manage their food in accordance with the recovery hierarchy. And what we found, after speaking with a bunch of different stakeholders in states that already have organic waste bans or would be implicated by them, some of whom are on the webinar today, which I saw their little names pop up. So that's great to see. But after speaking with a bunch of different stakeholders, we found that a really successful state organic waste ban should do a certain number of things. The first is kind of, how it actually is achieved. That's applying a tiered and phased in approach. So by starting with the generators who, generate the most waste and kind of are set up in a way that they're able to comply more quickly with the organic waste bans, like it really makes sense to start with them and then slowly phase in the rest of the generators. And that gives the businesses time to think about their practices and adapt how they're operating. It gives, the state government time to be able to think through how that's going to happen on the ground. It gives jurisdictions time to build up some of the infrastructure that's necessary, whether that's food recovery infrastructure or like even just building organics processing facilities. And the second aspect of best practices for organic waste bans that we pulled together here was to really, limit the number of exemptions and waivers. So essentially just make it apply to more people, right? The earliest adopters of an organic waste ban included certain waivers or exemptions to make sure, compliance could be feasible. And there wasn't actually that infrastructure that was even built yet. But some of those states like Vermont recognized like that was going to be a temporary waiver. And so they've now taken it away. And so, the more that you're able to get more people who have to reconsider their food waste practices, the better and the stronger that it'll be. Okay, the third best practice that we took away here was to delegate implementation, have an enforcement authority, and really to actually just start with outreach and education. So at the end of the day, like you're going to want to have the stick, right? To be able to say, you have to do this, you have to manage your waste in a certain way. But you also really want people to be doing the thing because, they know how to do it and they want to do it, not just like a fear of a fine. So, kind of focusing on that outreach piece is really important. And the last aspect, or the last of the model policy, I guess, here is to include some grant funding. So there's going to be a lot of money that's going to go into how you're changing your food business, or, food recovery organizations are going to have to scale the work that they're doing. There's going to be investment into building the organic processing infrastructure. And as much as you're able, like as a state, to offset that cost, the easier it is to get that compliance up front. So do you mind going to the next slide? Thank you. So kind of backing up again, like how we approach the toolkit. So we walk through these like top considerations like I just did. And then we also offer a number of different model states. And so for the organic waste bans, the model state that we have there that we kind of talk through a little bit more in detail is Vermont. They're unique because unlike a lot of all the other organic state waste bans, Vermont's food scrap ban eventually was designed to cover all generators, so all people and households, which it now does. And they have that fine system, so you could theoretically be fined if you're not in compliance with the waste ban, but their focus has historically really been that outreach and that education. And then, like I mentioned before, they started with a certain exemption. So you had to be located within a certain mile radius of an organic processing facility in order for the ban to apply to you. But ultimately, they changed their law and they phased that out. So that's why we consider them model policy. Do you mind going to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is the organic waste ban model legislation piece. And I won't linger on it too long because it's, legalese boringness, but what it kind of shows you is how we structured our model legislation, and we do this for each of the policies. So what you see in red there are kind of the decision points that we've flagged earlier in the toolkit, and we've talked through a little bit, and we're flagging them saying this is the place where you're going to have to like kind of plug in your own information, think about how you want to structure it, and we do that throughout the legislation for each policy. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to be a little bit more brief with food donation requirements, just because there's a lot of actual crossover in the model policy for organic waste bans and food donation requirements. But if you're not familiar, a food donation requirement, again, is kind of how it sounds. It's a requirement for certain generators of surplus food or food waste, whatever it may be, to donate any of their wholesome surplus food to people, to food recovery organizations who are willing and able to accept that food. And these can be passed independently of an organic waste ban or together. Really, the model here so far is just SB 1383 in California, which only went into effect in January of last year. So it's only been about a year. But even after just a year of that policy, there was a lot of work that went into it beforehand. And, we tried to have some of those conversations with stakeholders who've been affected by it, who've been running it. And what we heard, were a decent number of changes that were going to be necessary to kind of replicate that model in another jurisdiction. And so we kind of flagged what are those decision points. For example, one struggle point was kind of having multiple jurisdictions do the enforcement piece. And after hearing from so many of our food recovery organization stakeholders and food business stakeholders that was, really increasing the administrative burden, we're kind of more focusing on, partner with the local jurisdictions to do the education piece, but maybe have the enforcement piece be kind of at a higher level. So that's kind of an example of how we were thinking of through the decision points and like kind of the lessons learned piece that we pulled in. Next slide, please. So like I said before, SB 1383 in California is kind of our model here because they're the one that's like a little bit more, the most fleshed out so far, even though New York and Washington will eventually have this donation requirement as well. So they also have these kind of model components that I mentioned. So they set a food recovery target. They have that same phased in approach that I talked about with organic waste bans. They've done some great things. They've included grant funding for organizations like food recovery organizations that need to like kind of scale their work. They're really leading with the education and the stakeholder engagement rather than really like just focusing on any punishment or enforcement or whatever. Yeah, and so they also use that tiered approach, like I said, to start with those organizations who are best able to start donating. So you're getting that biggest impact at the beginning, but ultimately it's going to apply to more businesses. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, moving into the next kind of bucket here, which is encouraging food donation. So if the stick is the organic waste ban, making them change their ways. The tax incentive piece is how do we provide kind of a positive financial incentive to do what we want them to do, which is manage their food in a way that's more productive. So there's what we talk about in the toolkit too is like, we'll give some of this context in more detail, but at a high level for the purposes of this. There are already 2 federal incentives that apply to food donation. But after hearing from quite a few parties that like these incentives aren't really doing what they're meant to do, so they're not really like offsetting the costs associated with food donation, we were really like looking at all the different state incentives that are out there that build on those federal incentives in a way that's actually offsetting the costs associated with donation and therefore increasing food donation. So the goal with this tax incentive piece here was like really, again, remembering the end goal is to offset the costs associated with donation. But at the same time, like at the end of the day, this legislation has to get passed. You don't want to break the state's bank. So you're going to have some checks. And you also want to consider, the administrative burden associated with filing for an incentive in the first place. Like if the goal is to offset the donation costs, you have to give enough of incentive to get over that hurdle of like, okay, I'm going to have to file my taxes in a whole other way. So we met with a bunch of different stakeholders again in states who balance that kind of balance differently. And what we found about the best tax incentives and the aspects that we consider to be model policy is first that it can be kind of tailored. What's great about it is it can be tailored to a particular state. So if there are certain businesses within the state who need a little bit extra push or who aren't donating, who you really want to kind of focus in on, you're able to tailor your state incentive to target those people and provide that incentive. Another strong piece here for model policy is keeping the incentive as inclusive as possible so that it's actually used. So, right, there are a lot of different ways of limiting the incentive. So you can set a cap on the percentage of the value of the donated food that gets the tax incentive. You can cap the total amount that any taxpayer can claim. You can cap the amount that's claimed within the state. There's kind of a different way of running a tax incentive that way. So there's a bunch of different ways of limiting it, but at the same time, like if you limit it a little, like too much, then you're only going to be capturing 1 or 2 people who the incentive would apply to and would actually be financially beneficial for them. So our model policy takeaway here is kind of try and keep it broad. It might be a little scary, but at the end of the day, that'll get people to actually use it. And so along that same line too, there are a couple like particular ways that you can structure the tax incentive to make sure it's actually beneficial and offsetting the costs that you want it to. The first is to structure it as a tax credit. If you're not familiar, there are like two different types of tax incentives. One is a credit, so that's a direct reduction in the amount of taxes that you have to pay. And there's also a deduction, which the federal incentives are deductions, and they reduce your taxable income, which is then used to calculate the incentive. But that's all kind of like to say, what's important is tax credits are so much more beneficial to small businesses. And there are a lot of small businesses who really are the target entity to need this incentive, right? So like a producer or smaller food business, whatever it may be. So that's one way to kind of get them to get it to be, doing what you want it to do. Another like small change there is to calculate the incentive using the market value instead of the basis value, which, if you want the detail of that, I'm happy to talk about it later. I won't bore you, but at the end of the day, like the basis value is really hard to calculate. Again, it's low, it doesn't really capture all the costs, but if you use the fair market value, you are kind of getting at what you want to be getting at. And then finally, the last aspect I'll kind of talk about here is to offset transportation and processing costs. So a lot of the incentives, most of them, are focused at giving you an incentive for the value of the food that you're donating. But I'm sure a lot of you all work in the space and recognize like there's so much more that goes into a donation, whether it's transporting the food from the business to the food recovery organization, or taking the food and turning it into something that someone can actually eat. There's a lot of cost associated with that. So we're kind of like, if you want to be, the leader in this space, you should really try and offset those costs as well. Next slide, please. So our model here, again, is California. I swear, we look at a lot of other states, and a lot of other states are the models in the policies. So it's not just a California toolkit. But since they are the only state that offers the transportation specific credit that I mentioned, that's kind of why we put them here as the leader. But yeah, they have a great credit for offsetting the cost of the food, as well as a second credit that does the transportation piece. And so the California credit, like I said, it covers a broad range of foods. It used to only cover farmers and fresh produce, but now it's expanded and it covers more people, potential donors, covers more types of food that can be donated and get that incentive. And they also have a very reasonable cap on their credit. So there's no cap that any particular donor is limited to in recovering, but they do kind of set a limit on how much the percentage of the value of the food that can get that credit. Okay, so that's tax incentives. And the next policy, if you don't mind changing, thank you, is compost procurement. So this is the last policy I'll talk about today. And it's kind of the part of the developing end markets for compost bucket of policies that we have. And the idea is getting more compost out there that can be created from food scraps. So what we heard from stakeholders is that if we want to reduce the harms associated with food waste in our system, and we want people to give any food scraps that aren't inedible or whatever to composting facilities instead of landfill, we need to have those composting facilities in the first place. So if you want those composting facilities to be built, you need to create a model that's like financially beneficial to the investors, the developers who are building those composting facilities. And so how do you do that? That's, buying compost to create that demand. And that kind of really needs a kickstart in the United States right now. So what this policy is getting at in that developing end market piece is getting states to use their spending power to make progress to develop the end market. In this case, by purchasing compost derived from food scraps for the activities that they're already doing. So things like landscaping, construction, green infrastructure projects. And the model policy here is fairly, a simple end goal to try and procure as much as possible. So that means covering as many activities as possible that could, use compost derived from food scraps, cover a wide range of state agencies, but at the same time, like when you're purchasing all this compost, you want to make sure you're doing it in line with environmental science. So, using an established standard to ensure quality, make sure you're supporting the entities who are doing that work, who are doing that purchasing by providing resources, education, and requiring them to kind of track their records and do some reporting so we can keep that kind of shared learning process going around what works best. Next slide, please. Okay, so the model state here is Washington. State and local governments have to consider whether compost products can be used in government-funded projects. They have to prioritize local compost, so developing a local market, as well as compost made from food scraps. So really trying to focus in on that food waste piece without losing that the safety aspect of the compost. So those are the policies that we have today. They're, as Andrea showed on the earlier slide, like there are so many other policies within the toolkit that kind of do the same thing that I just did. Give the context of federal law a little bit more in detail than I did in this, and as well as, kind of walking through the decision points. What are the considerations? What have we learned from all the other stakeholders who have done this thing out there? And yeah, so it's really, it's meant to be a starting point. This toolkit's meant to be a starting point. Get the reader, whoever you may be, like thinking about what those decision points are. Consider who was left out of previous conversations. Maybe that should be considered in new ones, and just keep, progressing to make sure we have model policy across the United States. So that's it from me, and I'll hand it back for Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Tori, for going through each of the policies. We have gotten a couple of questions that have come through, and so I'm hoping, Dana, you'll also join us to answer a couple of these. Some of them are close, so we're going to try to group them together in a couple of ways. There was one that came through around IRA and IJA programs that can help states with grant dollars to implement. And I wanted to address this one, even though it's going to be a bit of a cop-out answer, but to say that the coalition is definitely thinking about these kinds of things. And we would love for you to join in and to have the conversation with us about what ways we can really make sure that the funding that is available from the federal government is getting utilized by states. But this toolkit itself talks more about policy than it does about the interplay between federal grants and state work. And so I think that could be an entire another webinar that maybe ReFed will be interested in putting on in the future.
Yeah, and maybe I could just add on to that. I think there are absolutely opportunities with the IRA money in particular, as states are submitting, their requests for their portion of the GHG reduction fund that EPA is administering. There's no question that several of these policies and programs that would help implement them are within the scope of things like, things like composting or AD infrastructure should be within the scope of that. I think it's a matter of finding the people within the state government that are creating those applications and making sure they understand the opportunity here and that it's a priority, and making sure that they're earmarking some of their request for this. I think that's really the trick, and who that is in each state and how you do that, that is at this point a little bit of an art, I think.
There's another question. Someone's interested in learning about the cost of each policy recommendation, particularly among states that have already established them. So they want to have us talk a little bit about implementation, outreach, and enforcement costs for each area of focus. And I know this was something we talked quite a bit about in developing the toolkit. Tori, do you want to take a stab at that? And then maybe Dana, you can talk a little bit more about some of the tools you have too.
Yeah, definitely. I think what's tricky too is like the cost is obviously going to vary between the policies and within the states that are doing that. But I think, like I mentioned with tax incentives, we were trying to balance, like at the end of the day, the state is going to try and consider, you know, how can they be most effective without draining the bank. I think with organic waste bans and food donation requirements, I think, you know, what we talked through there a little bit too is it's an expensive policy to do right, but I think if you want to do it, then you should be doing the kind of behind the scenes education, resource development, stakeholder outreach that does make it a little bit more expensive. So we kind of walk through that. I don't know that we necessarily give any like hard numbers on it. But yeah, we'll definitely within each policy kind of talk through how relatively expensive is this policy versus others. There are some that are a lot more low cost, like changing date labels within your state, or yeah. Is there anything you wanted to add there, Andrea, that you were thinking of?
I may have one thing to add, which is just that this is knowledge that's a few years old at this point, but my understanding is that a lot of the state tax incentives tend to go undersubscribed, and that when you look at the actual costs, they tend to be relatively lower than you would think sometimes. And then I would say the infrastructure costs they're just really enormous, frankly, to get to the level of infrastructure we would need to actually divert all of the organics, you know, out of a state if you're starting from scratch. And so I think just as a relative thing, the diversion is more expensive than some of those donation incentives. But also it doesn't all need to happen at once, right? And so you've seen a variety of states like Massachusetts, California, kind of over the course of several years, provide grants on the infrastructure so that over time it can get built out and not be overwhelming. And again, I think this is where, you know, there are huge amounts of money flowing through the IRA for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which I think is different from what Claudia posted. That's the climate pollution reduction grants, which are slightly different, also a decent sized pot of money though. But that's where I think some of that infrastructure can get built. And I've seen a bunch of states start to build it before a law is passed, because that starts to get some of the buy-in necessary to get laws passed.
Thanks. There's two questions around tax incentives that I thought we could take next to each other. The first one is, how does the tax incentive play with the tax benefit that folks are already getting for donation, and is it double dipping by the IRS?
So, like, is the question like, how does it interplay with the federal incentive, a state incentive?
I would assume so.
Yeah, okay, so there are some states, so the state incentives that we're talking about here that like can be passed is going to be around like the state income tax, right? Or so it would be kind of separate from the federal incentive. It wouldn't be like the IRS getting like, it doesn't really go through the IRS, it goes through the state system. But there are some states out there who also who say that if you get a certain discount, like you get a deduction with the federal incentive, okay, sorry, I'll slow down. So the federal incentive is a deduction. So it's lowering the taxable income that is then used to calculate how much taxes you owe. And there are some states who say we will recognize that same number to calculate our state income tax that we will take from you. So it's going to be like just using kind of the same incentive, but it's not really like taking money that's going to the IRS or something like that. So it's more just kind of aligning the way that they're treating the state income tax to be the same way that the federal government is doing it. Is that clear? I feel like I got a little caught up there, but hopefully clarified.
Hopefully, if someone has a follow-up, they can put it in the chat.
Okay, cool.
The second one is also around taxes and is around reporting. And they are asking if there are any examples of states where the donor does not pass the burden of tracking donations onto the volunteers or the nonprofits who are receiving the food.
So for the food donation requirement.
Right.
Yeah, so right now the food donation requirement is really just in California. And we had a lot of back and forth internally when we were writing this policy where we were like, okay, this is the way that California does it. Like California says that the food recovery organizations that are receiving food through a contract by a business who is subject to the food donation requirement, that food recovery organization, if they're the ones who are, opening themselves up to that donation space, then they're going to be the ones who have to do the reporting. And on the one hand, we were like considering, is that equitable? Is that fair to put that burden on food recovery organizations? But on the other hand, like if we have food businesses who are doing all that reporting and recovery, like that's also kind of tricky. Like that is kind of a weird incentive that we're creating there, or like not incentive isn't quite the right word, but anyway, we kind of came to the point where we decided to stick with the way in our model policy discussion, the way that California does it, because we were kind of, I guess, assuaged like of the fear that it would be impacting small food recovery organizations, because again, like the local pantry down the street, if they're not entering into a contract with Michael's to recover food on a systematic basis, like then they don't have to be subject to these administrative burdens. They can still receive that food from an Albertsons or a Safeway or whatever your grocery store is. They can still receive those donations, but yeah, they won't be subject to the reporting requirement, if that makes sense. So if you're the food business, you can still donate to whoever you want. You just need to prove your compliance with the food donation requirement by having kind of like a contract, a standing contract in place.
Yeah, we had thought quite a bit about this particular question and tried to come up with some creative solutions. And in many ways, we decided that you need to have some kind of a check, and that's a main reason why this reporting requirement gets pulled in so much. So I appreciate the question. It's one we thought about a lot. There's a similar question that's very specific to the California donation requirement that asks whether their evaluation also checks to see if food recipients are being dumped on. And I would say that the specifics of the California bill are ones that we've kind of looked at a little bit in how the toolkit talks about best practices. And one of the ways that we have, again, similar to the previous question, we've hoped that these contracts give more power to the food recipients so that they can say, it is not within our contract to receive food that we are not interested in receiving. And therefore, they have some of the power that doesn't require an external evaluator to determine what food they're receiving and whether it is good food. Tori, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I think that sounds exactly right. Like the requirement falls on the food business to do the thing. There's still not any requirement on the food recovery organizations to accept the food. So I think if at the end of the day that is happening, down the line, there could be kind of a conversation around, well, food business isn't really in compliance with the requirement if they're only providing food that can actually be accepted or isn't wanted by food recovery organizations.
I might jump in here to also say that, I think the donation requirement really flips the power dynamics around quite a bit. So though not expressly in any of the regulations, I mean, what happens is those folks who are picking up and rescuing the food are all of a sudden a much more important service provider. And I think that allows them to have a little more weight in being able to say no, right? And they are getting more food and not kind of be in this position of like, well, we need it, so we'll take anything and then we'll just deal with the stuff that we're not going to use. So kind of inadvertently, I think there's a benefit as well.
And I see there's a follow-up about the question was around tax incentives. rather than the donation requirement. But I think that still applies, that you still need some kind of a receipt to be able to give evidence that a transaction occurred. And because it's transactional for IRS concerns, that's where it stands.
Yeah. And I think it's also like, it's part of making sure that there's no like tricky business going on, saying that you're receiving an incentive when you're not. Like having that proof, I think, is important. But I think I will flag that we, whenever this kind of comes up, points to another section of our toolkit, which is around grant funding and making sure you're really providing that support to the food recovery organizations who are doing all this hard work, who need that kind of day-to-day funding for administrative overhead. Definitely recognize that, and it's part of our toolkit, and we kind of point to that piece.
And I think they're asking sort of like, why is the donor getting the tax incentive when it takes the resources, or because they're required by the rescue organization. And what we're seeing happen is that in some cases the donor is having to pay the rescue organization to come do that rescue, right? Because they pay for their garbage, they pay for their compost service. Why should this much more complicated function be free? And you get a tax benefit. And I think we are starting to see the donation requirement sort of create that the ability for the rescue organizations to charge.
There's also a question about harvesting, which I'm going to interpret as also being gleaning for states with food left unharvested in the field, and it costs growers to go back into the field to harvest. No, it doesn't get to the market. So are there other ways of including gleaning in either tax incentives or I believe it was related to donation?
Yeah, so I think that would come in with the processing piece that we recommend as a additional tax incentive of, recognizing like wanting to offset some of that processing cost. There can be a different way that you kind of set up the tax incentive to do that.
And I would say it's not a tax incentive, I don't think, but I know that in Pennsylvania, they have something called the PASS program, PASS, and that actually provides funds to cover the pick and pack out costs of farmers who are donating their food. So I don't think it has to be a tax incentive. There are state programs that are looking at covering those costs, without getting into taxes.
And there's a comment that I think we could probably also comment back on to turn it into a question, where Kyle acknowledges the importance of grant funding as seed money for infrastructure development, but has a thought on the need for more ongoing sustainable funding mechanisms to ensure that there's long-standing implementation. And it might be easier for organics collection and recycling, but do folks have thoughts on how to do this for edible food recovery, which I think is related to another question we saw later on?
Yeah, this is like something that definitely came out of our stakeholder conversations as we were just kind of, being in the space, and particularly when we were writing the toolkit, is thinking about what are the barriers to scaling food recovery that are out there, and what are the needs to support their food recovery organizations who are asking to do so much more work. And this is like consistent feedback that we've gotten from food recovery organizations across the United States, that there's often a lot of times like funding for things like refrigeration or trucks, but like not really that consistent administrative overhead funding that it takes to run a food recovery organization. So we flag that as something that states can provide through grant funding if they want to be supportive of food recovery organizations, especially if they're doing something like an organic waste ban or food donation requirement, where just like they're going to be building in the education and the resource support for food businesses who have to change their practices, you also have to build on that support to food recovery organizations who are doing the same. And I will also say, like, I know this is the state toolkit conversation, but this has been a big part of the coalition's like conversation around federal funding. So people were talking about, grant funding through the federal government, whether that's IRA or some other mechanism. We've, tried to have very consistent messaging that, some grant funding is really great, but what's the need that really needs to be addressed is that consistent overhead funding. So I think this is definitely a work in progress in getting that support like built out at the federal level and state level.
And I would just add, I don't think this is only a public sector, that's where being able to charge to come pick up food comes in. I mean, that's really the way that this becomes sustainable is that if those rescue organizations can charge to pick up the food and sometimes charge to give out the food, a nominal fee, right? Not deeply discounted, but that they don't necessarily have to give away the food completely free. And both of those sides can help to fund the whole sector.
And there's one last question that I'm hoping each person can take before we close out. But the question is, what policies do you think are the most likely to be instituted by various states, which seem to be the most popular? And what do you think would have the most impact? Do we want to do Tori, then I'll go, then Dana, you can close us out and close out the webinar as well.
Sure. So I think we tried to cover them actually in this one. I'd say most potential for impact, probably organic waste bans and food donation requirements. I mentioned there are 10 states out there who are now doing it. I think that's, increasingly being looked to as a model. And I think food donation requirements in particular have also been people are intrigued by it. Even if they recognize that it's going to be expensive and difficult to do, and only one state has done it so far. But I think also most popular in terms of the stakeholders that we worked with so far is definitely tax incentives, getting food businesses that a little like financial benefit to do what they should probably already be doing, which is donating their wholesome surplus food.
Maybe I shouldn't have had us each go because I think I echo a lot of what Tori's already said, but I do think that the power of the mandatory recycling and organic waste bans is not to be discounted, that it does have a lot of prevention trickle-on effect, and the ability to be able to also include some donation requirements is pretty profound in shaping how we think about our food system and food waste as a potential resource that could then go back into feeding compost, that we should really be making sure that food does not become waste in the first place. So I think that that's a pretty impactful way of looking holistically at the issue and incorporating a lot of different stakeholders with one omnibus kind of package legislation. I would say that I've heard a lot of support, and as we've looked at what states already have policies, K through 12 policies, whether those are share tables or otherwise, are always popular and are ones that are pretty easy to put forward, in part because everyone agrees that getting kids to eat food is a tricky business, and being able to share that food around is a value add all the way along. Dina, do you want to also answer the question?
Sure. Well, I love that, Andrea, on the schools, because I think things like share tables are such a no-brainer that, who's opposed to that really? And so that's almost like just an easy win that we should all be doing. Every school in the country should just be doing. And I also want to say that Kyle Pogue has kindly offered. I was sitting here going, gosh, we should really give Kyle some of these questions, but Kyle at Cal Recycle just put his email in the chat. So definitely take him up, because he has been a key implementer of SB 1383 in California and can answer many questions and probably help you avoid many pain points. My answer is in line with yours, but I'll give a little more context. So anyone who knows me knows that I am a prevention first person through and through when it comes to food waste. I believe strongly in that, but I have to say my mind has really been challenged lately because of some climate events that I've attended, talking about the importance of methane and how if we really can reduce methane, not in the next 5 to 10 years, that buys us so much more time to deal with some of the CO2 challenges. And given that, that makes organics bans all the more important, right? They are the single most powerful policy move that we can make to buy ourselves that time when it comes to methane and climate implications. And so while I probably would have said that anyway, I think I say it now with a little bit more emphasis because time is short and methane is powerful. So I think now is really the time for that. And yes, and if that's not possible, I think landfill fees are another way to get at that problem without a complete ban. And especially when those fees get reinvested into prevention programs. So that's my answer there. And with that, first of all, I hope you guys can see what an amazing body of work that Andrea and Tori have put together on behalf of the Zero Food Waste Coalition. We are so grateful. They have really dived in and they have made this so actionable. And so please use it, share it, send it to anyone you know in any state who thinks they want, who can kind of take it. I've already heard from people in Michigan that they're using it to go to leaders there. So you don't have to be a state policy maker to use this. You can be, just a motivated person who can take it up to your state legislators. And oftentimes it just takes one legislator who's really interested in it to start getting it out there. So with that, thank you, Tori. Thank you, Andrea, for joining us today, for sharing this. Thanks to everyone for listening in. I know everyone is so busy. And as I said earlier, we'll be sharing an email with the toolkit and the survey in a few days, not a transcript. Everyone can reach out to Martha for that. But please be on the lookout for that email. And you can use the contact information on the screen to stay connected to the work of the Zero Food Waste Coalition. Please feel free to reach out to info@zerofoodwastecoalition.org if you'd like to become a participant in that coalition. We invite any and all organizations to do that. And we'd love to hear from you. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks so much for joining.